Adolf Hitler's story does not begin with dictatorship, genocide, or war. It begins in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn on April 20th, 1889. The world into which he was born was one of tradition, rigid hierarchy, and empire. He was the son of Alois Hitler, a strict customs official, and Clara Hitler, a devoted, protective mother. From the beginning, Adolf's childhood was marked by tension. His father was authoritarian, stern, and often violent. Young Adolf clashed constantly with him, rejecting his father's demands to pursue a career in civil service. Instead, he dreamed of becoming an artist, a dream that would shape, frustrate, and eventually embitter him. When his father died in 1903, Adolf gained freedom from his father's dominance, but also lost stability. His school grades declined. He became moody, rebellious, and detached. His mother, Clara, was his one source of affection. Her death in 1907 devastated him and left him untethered. By 1908, Hitler lived in Vienna, struggling to make a living as an artist. Twice he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, and twice he was rejected. This rejection was a turning point. In the streets of Vienna, he was exposed to radical political ideas, nationalism, and, most dangerously, anti-Semitism. He began to absorb conspiracy theories that blamed Jews, Marxists, and foreign powers for Austria's problems. In these years, Hitler formed the foundations of his worldview: that history was a struggle between races, that the German people needed unity and strength, and that weak governments were betraying the nation. When World War I erupted in 1914, Hitler volunteered for the German army. For him, the war was transformative. He served as a dispatch runner, earning medals for bravery, but never rising above corporal. For the first time, he felt a sense of belonging, a cause greater than himself. But Germany's defeat in 1918 was shattering. For Hitler, it was more than a military loss. It was humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations, territorial losses, and a stigma of guilt upon Germany. To many veterans like Hitler, it felt like betrayal from within. They embraced the myth that Germany had been stabbed in the back by socialists, Jews, and weak politicians. It was here, in the aftermath of war, that Adolf Hitler's bitterness hardened into ideology. He would dedicate his life to overturning the humiliation of Versailles, destroying the enemies he believed had betrayed Germany, and restoring the nation to greatness, no matter the cost. The year is 1919. Germany lies in ruins, its economy shattered, its empire dismantled, and its people humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Bread lines stretch down the streets, children grow up hungry, and veterans, once celebrated, now wander jobless. For Adolf Hitler, the war's end was more than defeat. It was betrayal. Like many Germans, he believed the nation had not truly lost on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home. This poisonous myth would become central to Nazi propaganda. The Versailles Treaty demanded that Germany disarm, pay reparations worth billions, and accept blame for the entire war. Millions of Germans felt humiliated, resentful, and angry. The fragile new democracy, the Weimar Republic, inherited the burden of enforcing this hated treaty. Hitler, now a drifting veteran in Munich, was searching for purpose, and he soon found it. In 1919, Hitler was assigned by the army to monitor small political groups that were sprouting across Germany. One of these was the German Workers' Party, DAP, a tiny nationalist, anti-Semitic movement. At first, Hitler attended only as an observer, but one evening, during a heated debate, he stood up and gave an impassioned speech. His charisma electrified the room. By September 1919, he officially joined the party. His ability to captivate an audience quickly made him its rising star. In 1920, the DAP changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or simply the Nazis. Contrary to its name, the Nazi Party was not socialist in the Marxist sense. Its program blended radical nationalism, racial purity, anti-Semitism, and anti-Marxism. Hitler helped draft the party's 25-point program, which promised to reject Versailles, expand Germany's territory, and purify the nation of supposed enemies. Hitler understood that politics wasn't just about policies. It was about symbols, spectacle, and emotion. He designed the party's flag, a black swastika on a white circle with a red background, simple, bold, and unforgettable. He perfected his oratory, delivering fiery speeches in beer halls that stirred crowds into frenzy. He railed against Jews, Marxists, and the November criminals who signed the Versailles Treaty. For ordinary Germans who felt powerless and humiliated, Hitler's words offered anger, clarity, and hope. The Nazi Party remained small, but its energy and theatricality set it apart. By 1923, Germany was collapsing into chaos. Hyperinflation made money worthless. People carried wages in wheelbarrows, only to find that bread cost twice as much by the afternoon. In this turmoil, extremists from both left and right battled for power. Hitler saw an opportunity. Inspired by Mussolini's recent March on Rome in Italy, he believed he could seize power in Bavaria and march on Berlin. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers stormed a beer hall in Munich, where Bavarian leaders were meeting. With pistol raised, Hitler declared a national revolution. But the coup failed. Police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. Hitler's trial became a turning point. Instead of silencing him, it gave him a national platform. He framed himself not as a traitor, but as a patriot who loved Germany too much to obey corrupt politicians. The judges, sympathetic to his nationalism, gave him a light sentence, 5 years, of which he served only 9 months. In prison, Hitler dictated his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In it, he laid out his worldview, that history was a racial struggle, that Jews were the root of Germany's problems, and that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, through territorial expansion in Eastern Europe. Though few read the book at first, Mein Kampf would later serve as the blueprint for his dictatorship. The failed Beer Hall Putsch taught Hitler an important lesson. Seizing power by force was dangerous. The future of Nazism would not come through street rebellion, but through legal, political means. Hitler would cloak his radical agenda in the trappings of democracy, only to dismantle it once he reached the top. Adolf Hitler was no longer just a bitter veteran or a failed artist. He was a man with a mission, a party, and a dangerous vision for Germany's future. When Adolf Hitler walked out of Landsberg prison in December 1924, he was not the same man who had stormed a Munich beer hall with pistol in hand. The failed coup had nearly destroyed his movement. But prison had taught him something invaluable. The path to power in Germany was not through rebellion, but through politics. The Nazi Party was temporarily banned after the putsch, and its leaders scattered. Yet Hitler was determined to rebuild, and this time more carefully. In 1925, Hitler relaunched the NSDAP legally and publicly. But he no longer relied solely on fiery speeches. He reorganized the party into a disciplined machine. He created regional party branches across Germany. He appointed loyal lieutenants like Joseph Goebbels, who became a master of propaganda, and Heinrich Himmler, who would later command the SS. He introduced the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the Brown Shirts, a paramilitary wing that intimidated opponents, clashed with communists, and created a sense of fear and power on the streets. The Nazi Party was no longer just a small group of fanatics. It was becoming a movement with structure, spectacle, and reach. If politics is theater, Hitler was both director and actor. He understood how to stage rallies, design posters, and use symbols to stir emotions. His speeches were carefully choreographed, beginning calmly, then rising in passion until he had whipped the crowd into frenzy. The Nazi flag, uniforms, and salute gave members a sense of unity and power. Goebbels began publishing newspapers and pamphlets that spread Nazi ideas far beyond Munich. For millions of struggling Germans, Nazi propaganda offered both a scapegoat and a promise. Blame the Jews, Marxists, and Versailles. Trust Hitler to restore greatness. Though not widely read in the 1920s, Mein Kampf circulated among Nazi supporters. Its ideas were clear and dangerous. Racial hierarchy. Hitler declared Germans to be a master race. Anti-Semitism. Jews were painted as enemies of civilization. Expansionism. Germany needed Lebensraum, or living space, to the east, even if it meant war. Hitler's ideology was no secret. He wrote it plainly, and he would later act on it without hesitation. The mid-1920s were years of relative stability for the Weimar Republic. Under foreign loans and new leadership, Germany's economy began to recover. The Nazis, preaching rage and revolution, seemed less relevant. In the 1928 elections, they won only 2.6% of the vote, a humiliating setback. For a moment, it seemed Hitler might remain on the fringes of politics. But history was about to hand him an opportunity. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market crash in America sent shockwaves across the world. Germany, heavily dependent on American loans, was devastated. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment soared to 6 million people by 1932. In times of stability, Hitler's radicalism seemed dangerous, but in times of crisis, his fiery promises suddenly sounded appealing. The Nazis promised jobs, national pride, and an end to humiliation. They blamed scapegoats, Jews, communists, and weak Weimar politicians for Germany's suffering, and millions listened. Between 1929 and 1930, Nazi support exploded. Their rallies drew tens of thousands. Their propaganda reached villages, towns, and cities across Germany. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazis shocked the nation by winning 18% of the vote, becoming the second largest party in Germany. Hitler had transformed failure into opportunity. In just 5 years, he had rebuilt his party from obscurity into a national force. His vision was no longer confined to Munich beer halls. It was echoing across Germany, carried by anger, fear, and desperation. The man who once seemed like a fanatic on the margins was now a contender for real power. But this was only the beginning. The years ahead would see Hitler push beyond politics into total power. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation on the brink. The Great Depression had ravaged the economy. 6 million people were unemployed. Families starved while politicians bickered in the Reichstag. Street violence erupted daily between communists and nationalists. In this storm of despair, one man claimed he had the answers: Adolf Hitler. The Nazis offered something that few other parties could: simplicity. They promised jobs and prosperity. They pledged to tear up the hated Versailles Treaty. They vowed to protect Germany from communism. And they identified scapegoats: Jews, Marxists, and traitors who had weakened the nation. For a desperate people, these promises were intoxicating. They didn't just offer solutions, they offered hope. The 1930 Reichstag elections marked the Nazi Party's first major breakthrough. 107 seats, second only to the Social Democrats. By July 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany, with 37% of the vote. Nearly 14 million Germans supported Hitler. Hitler himself campaigned tirelessly, flying across Germany by plane, a revolutionary tactic at the time. His speeches, delivered with fiery conviction, drew massive crowds. He presented himself not as a politician, but as Germany's savior. But winning votes was not enough. Hitler needed power, and that meant winning over Germany's conservative elites, businessmen, military leaders, and President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging World War I hero. At first, they despised him. Hindenburg dismissed Hitler as a bohemian corporal, an untrustworthy rabble-rouser. But Germany's elites feared communism even more. They believed they could use Hitler, appoint him to office, control him, and harness his popularity for their own purposes. It would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Meanwhile, the Nazi SA, the Brown Shirts, were waging war on Germany's streets. Clashes with communist groups left hundreds dead. Political opponents were beaten, intimidated, and silenced. The violence created chaos, and chaos created demand for a strong hand to restore order. Hitler positioned himself as that strong hand. In 1932, Hitler challenged Hindenburg for the presidency. Though he lost, winning 36% to Hindenburg's 53%, it was an astonishing result for a man who had been unknown a decade earlier. Even in defeat, Hitler had proven the strength of his movement. Germany's political system was crumbling. No party could secure a stable majority in parliament. Governments fell one after another. The country was paralyzed. On January 30th, 1933, the Conservatives made their fateful decision. Believing they could control him, they convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. It was a moment that would change the course of history. Adolf Hitler, a failed artist, a corporal of the Great War, a man who had once tried to seize power in a Munich beer hall, was now the leader of Europe's largest nation. The Nazis celebrated with torchlight parades through Berlin. Few realized that this was not just a political change, it was the death knell of democracy in Germany. The lesson of Hitler's rise is clear. He did not seize power by force. He was handed it by elites who underestimated him, by citizens who sought easy answers, and by a system too weak to resist him. Dictatorship does not always arrive with violence at first. Sometimes it enters quietly, through elections, backroom deals, and promises of stability. But Hitler was not content to share power. Once in office, he would move swiftly to dismantle democracy and create a dictatorship unlike any the world had ever seen. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler is sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. For many, it seemed like a normal transfer of power. After all, Germany was still a democracy, with a president, a parliament, and a constitution. But Hitler was not content with sharing power. Within months, he would dismantle democracy, crush opposition, and establish a totalitarian regime. Only 4 weeks into Hitler's chancellorship, disaster struck. On the night of February 27, 1933, flames engulfed the Reichstag building, Germany's parliament. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested inside. The Nazis immediately blamed the communists, claiming the fire was part of a massive uprising. In reality, Historians still debate whether the Nazis orchestrated it themselves. But one fact is certain: Hitler used the fire as a weapon. The very next day, President Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree at Hitler's urging. This law suspended basic freedoms: freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy. The police could arrest and imprison anyone without trial. Overnight, Germany became a police state. With the opposition crippled, Hitler called new elections. The Nazis unleashed a campaign of terror. Opponents were jailed, beaten, or silenced. The press was censored. On March 5, 1933, the Nazis won 44% of the vote. Not a majority, but with intimidation and alliances, Hitler was close to absolute control. The final step came 3 weeks later. On March 23rd, the Reichstag met in Berlin's Kroll Opera House. Surrounded by armed SA men, deputies voted on the Enabling Act, a law that would give Hitler the power to pass legislation without parliament, effectively ending democracy. Hitler promised to use the powers responsibly, but everyone knew the truth. This was the death of the Weimar Republic. The act passed, with only the Social Democrats daring to vote against it. From that moment on, the Reichstag was irrelevant. Germany was no longer a democracy. Hitler ruled by decree. Hitler moved swiftly to consolidate power in a process called Gleichschaltung, or coordination. State governments were dissolved and replaced by Nazi officials. Trade unions were banned. Workers were forced into a Nazi labor front. Opposition parties were outlawed. By July 1933, Germany was a one-party state. Teachers, judges, and civil servants were required to swear loyalty to Hitler. Every aspect of German life was brought under Nazi control. But Hitler's grip was not yet secure. Inside his own movement, the SA, the paramilitary brown shirts, threatened his authority. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, dreamed of replacing the army with the SA and pushing for a second revolution. The German military and conservative elites demanded Röhm be removed. On the night of June 30th, 1934, Hitler struck. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Nazi forces arrested and executed Röhm and dozens of SA leaders. Other rivals and critics, even former allies, were also killed. The purge sent a chilling message. Opposition, even within the Nazi movement, would not be tolerated. In August 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg died. Instead of calling new elections, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President. He declared himself Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Chancellor of the Reich. The army, once wary of him, swore an oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler personally. Germany was no longer a republic. It was a dictatorship. One man now held absolute power over the nation. In just 18 months, Hitler had taken a democratic state and gutted it from within. He did not abolish democracy in a single stroke. He strangled it step by step. Emergency powers, propaganda, intimidation, and fear. It is a warning from history. Dictators rarely seize power all at once. They dismantle freedom slowly, using crises to justify control until it is too late to resist. The stage was set. Germany had a Führer, and now he would begin building a regime that sought not only to control a nation, but to remake the world. By 1934, Adolf Hitler had secured total power. The Weimar Republic was dead, replaced by the Third Reich. The Nazi state was more than a dictatorship. It was a regime that sought to control not just politics, but every aspect of German life: thought, culture, economy, and even family. Hitler promised a national rebirth. To millions of Germans weary of chaos and humiliation, the Nazi state seemed to offer stability, pride, and order. But beneath the spectacle lay a system of terror, indoctrination, and ruthless control. Central to Nazi rule was propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, mastered the use of media to glorify the regime. Radio broadcasts carried Hitler's speeches into every home. Films like Triumph of the Will presented him as a messianic figure. Posters, songs, and parades created a culture of constant devotion. Hitler was not just a politician. He was portrayed as Germany's savior, the Führer who embodied the will of the people. Behind the propaganda was fear. The Gestapo, or secret police, rooted out dissent. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Whispered criticism could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. Concentration camps, first established in 1933, grew in number. At first, they held political opponents: communists, socialists, trade unionists. But soon, they expanded to include Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone deemed undesirable. The camps became symbols of Nazi terror, laboratories of brutality that foreshadowed the horrors to come. The Nazis understood. To control the future, they had to control the young. Boys were trained in the Hitler Youth, drilled in discipline, loyalty, and militarism. Girls joined the League of German Girls, taught to embrace motherhood and serve the nation. School textbooks were rewritten to glorify nationalism and racial purity. From childhood, Germans were immersed in Nazi ideology. In Nazi Germany, loyalty to the Führer came before loyalty to family, church, or conscience. Economically, Hitler delivered results that impressed many Germans. Massive public works projects, like the Autobahn, provided jobs. Rearmament programs expanded factories and armed forces. Unemployment dropped dramatically, from 6 million in 1933 to fewer than 1 million by 1936. To many, it seemed Hitler had saved the economy. But the recovery was built on militarization and exploitation. Germany was preparing for war long before the first shots were fired. At the core of Nazi ideology was racism. Jews were systematically excluded from public life. In 1933, Jewish teachers, judges, and civil servants were dismissed. Jewish businesses were boycotted. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and forbade marriage with Aryans. Anti-Semitism, once confined to speeches and newspapers, was now state policy. In 1938, hatred erupted violently in Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Nazi paramilitaries destroyed synagogues, looted Jewish shops, and beat Jews in the streets. Over 30,000 were arrested and sent to camps. Kristallnacht was a turning point. It showed that persecution of Jews was no longer social prejudice. It was organized, state-driven terror. While consolidating control at home, Hitler pursued bold moves abroad. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, violating Versailles. Britain and France, eager to avoid war, did nothing. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Crowds cheered him as a hero. Later that year, at the Munich Conference, Britain and France agreed to let Hitler take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, hoping to appease him. Each gamble emboldened Hitler further. Each act of appeasement convinced him the Western powers were weak. By March 1939, Germany had occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, clear proof that Hitler's ambitions would not be contained by diplomacy. Between 1934 and 1939, Hitler transformed Germany. He built a cult of personality, created a police state, revived the economy, and expanded his nation's territory, all while systematically persecuting Jews and minorities. The world watched uneasily, but few acted. Many underestimated him, believing his ambitions could be satisfied. They were wrong. Hitler was preparing for something far greater and far more destructive. The stage was set. Hitler had forged his state, armed his people, and silenced his enemies. The world was on the edge of catastrophe. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. At first glance, his position seemed fragile. His Nazi party did not have an outright majority, and conservatives in government believed they could control him. But they underestimated Hitler's cunning. Within weeks, a national emergency gave him the opening he had been waiting for. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, was engulfed in flames. Hitler's regime immediately blamed communists, portraying them as enemies of the state plotting revolution. Though historians still debate who started the fire, what is certain is that Hitler seized the crisis with ruthless efficiency. He convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assemble. From that moment, Germany was no longer a functioning democracy. In March 1933, Hitler made his next move. He introduced the Enabling Act, legislation that would give him the power to enact laws without the Reichstag's approval. To pass, it required a 2/3 majority vote. The Nazis unleashed a campaign of terror to ensure it passed. Communist deputies were banned. Opposition politicians were intimidated, beaten, or imprisoned. Surrounded by SA stormtroopers inside the chamber, deputies voted under duress. The law passed. With the stroke of a pen, Hitler's dictatorship was legalized. The Reichstag would become nothing more than a rubber stamp body. Caution for today. When crises are used as excuses to grant unchecked power to one leader, democracy stands on the edge of destruction. Even within his own party, Hitler faced rivals. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, had grown into a massive paramilitary force. Röhm wanted a second revolution, a more radical social upheaval. But Hitler needed the support of Germany's military elites and industrialists. In June 1934, Hitler struck decisively. Over the course of several nights, Nazi operatives carried out mass killings of Röhm and other perceived enemies. This purge, known as the Night of the Long Knives, eliminated opposition within the party and reassured the army and business leaders that Hitler's focus was national power, not class revolution. By August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, leader of Germany. The army swore an oath, not to the Constitution, but personally to Adolf Hitler. Once firmly in control, Hitler set out to shape every aspect of German society. Propaganda was his most powerful weapon. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a relentless campaign to glorify Hitler and demonize enemies. Posters showed Hitler as a savior. Radio broadcasts echoed his speeches into every home. Films, newspapers, schools, and even children's books were saturated with Nazi ideology. Education was reshaped to instill loyalty to the Führer. Youth organizations, such as the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated children from an early age. Art, music, and literature were censored. Only works that aligned with Nazi values were allowed. The message was clear: there was no escape from Nazi Germany's ideology. Propaganda was one side of the regime's power. Fear was the other. The Gestapo, secret police, infiltrated society, hunting down dissenters. Neighbors informed on each other, whether out of loyalty, fear, or personal gain. The first concentration camps were built not for Jews, but for political opponents, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and anyone who dared speak out. Dachau, established in 1933, became a symbol of terror. Through arrests, imprisonment, and intimidation, resistance was crushed before it could spread. Caution for today. When citizens are encouraged to inform on each other, when fear replaces trust, and when political dissent is criminalized, a society steps toward tyranny. At the heart of Hitler's rule was his racial ideology. He defined Germany's future not by democracy or equality, but by blood. According to him, only so-called Aryans were true Germans. Jews, Roma, the disabled, and other groups were labeled as inferior. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 institutionalized this racism. Jews were stripped of citizenship, banned from marrying non-Jews, and excluded from professions and public life. This was more than prejudice. It was systematic exclusion, the first legal steps toward annihilation. Hitler's ambitions were never confined to Germany's borders. He dreamed of conquest, of a German empire stretching across Europe. To achieve this, he broke the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, Germany reintroduced conscription and began rearming on a massive scale. The military swelled with new recruits. Weapons factories roared to life. The international community, weary of conflict after World War I, hesitated to respond. Britain and France adopted a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid confrontation. Hitler interpreted their silence as weakness. Step by step, Germany prepared for war. By the late 1930s, Hitler's grip on Germany was absolute. He had eliminated political rivals, won the loyalty of the military, and controlled both culture and law. His vision of a racially pure, militarized society was no longer a fringe idea. It was the law of the land. This transformation did not happen overnight. It happened through a series of small steps, each justified as necessary for order, safety, or national pride. Caution for today. Democracy rarely collapses in a single dramatic moment. It erodes gradually, often while citizens remain convinced they are still free. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions could no longer be contained within Germany's borders. His first target was his homeland, Austria. The Treaty of Versailles and its successor agreements had forbidden the unification of Germany and Austria, but Hitler ignored these restrictions. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria, greeted by cheering crowds. The so-called Anschluss, or union, was complete. There was no significant resistance. Many Austrians welcomed the merger, believing it would strengthen their economy and restore national pride. For Hitler, it was more than a territorial gain. It was a deeply personal triumph. Caution for today. Aggressors rarely present their moves as invasions. They call them unifications, liberations, or peaceful annexations. Hitler's next move was Czechoslovakia. He claimed that ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland, a border region, were being mistreated. His propaganda machine fueled anger and demanded protection for them. Europe trembled on the edge of war, but instead of confronting Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sought compromise. At the Munich Conference in September 1938, Britain and France agreed to let Hitler annex the Sudetenland in exchange for his promise of no further expansion. Chamberlain returned to London declaring he had secured peace for our time. But for Hitler, Munich was not the end. It was only the beginning. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise. German forces invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, dismantling the country completely. This was no longer about uniting Germans, it was about domination. Hitler had revealed his true intentions: expansion by force. The world could no longer pretend appeasement would stop him. Despite his hatred for communism, Hitler was pragmatic. To secure his eastern flank, he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Joseph Stalin in August 1939. This non-aggression pact shocked the world. Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, agreed not to fight each other. Secretly, they also agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. For Hitler, it meant he could invade Poland without fearing Soviet intervention. For Stalin, it bought time to rebuild his military. On September 1, 1939, German forces launched a blitzkrieg, lightning war, against Poland. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved with speed and coordination the world had never seen. Within weeks, Poland was overwhelmed. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling their pact. This time, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. After a period of relative calm known as the Phony War, Hitler struck west in May 1940. His armies swept through Belgium and bypassed French defenses along the Maginot Line. In just 6 weeks, France, one of Europe's great powers, collapsed. Paris fell. The French government surrendered. Britain now stood alone against Hitler. To conquer Britain, Hitler needed control of the skies. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched massive bombing raids. Fighter planes clashed over London, the countryside, and the English Channel. But Britain's Royal Air Force, aided by radar and sheer determination, fought back fiercely. Winston Churchill, Britain's new Prime Minister, rallied the nation with speeches that inspired defiance. "We shall never surrender." The Luftwaffe failed to break Britain. For the first time, Hitler's advance was stopped. As Hitler's armies conquered Europe, his racial ideology spread with them. Occupied territories were reorganized for the benefit of Germany. Resources were stripped. Millions of forced laborers were deported to work in German factories. The persecution of Jews escalated. Ghettos were established in Poland, where Jewish communities were isolated, starved, and brutalized. The seeds of genocide were being sown. In June 1941, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin. Launching Operation Barbarossa, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with over 3 million soldiers, the largest military operation in history. Hitler believed the conquest of the Soviet Union would secure Germany's living space and eliminate communism. At first, German forces advanced rapidly, capturing vast territories. But they underestimated the Soviet Union's resilience and the brutal Russian winter. By the end of 1941, the offensive stalled outside Moscow. For the first time, Hitler's aura of invincibility began to crack. From Austria to Poland, from Paris to Moscow, Hitler had unleashed a war that engulfed the world. His ambitions had no limits. He cloaked aggression in the language of liberation, exploited appeasement, and used military might to impose his vision. Caution for today. Dictators thrive when the world refuses to confront them early. Each concession emboldens them. Each silence encourages their next step. By 1941, Hitler's war was not only about conquest, it was about extermination. His racial ideology demanded the destruction of entire peoples, especially the Jews. What began as discrimination and exclusion escalated into mass murder. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference, where they formalized the plan for the final solution to the Jewish question: the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. deportations began. Jews from across occupied Europe were rounded up and transported to camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. These were not merely prisons, they were death factories. Gas chambers, crematoria, and forced labor claimed millions of lives. By the war's end, 6 million Jews had been murdered, alongside millions of Poles, Roma, disabled people, Soviet POWs, and others the Nazis deemed undesirable. This was genocide on an industrial scale. Not all surrendered to Nazi rule. Resistance movements rose across Europe, in France, Poland, Yugoslavia, and even within Germany itself. Brave men and women sabotaged railways, spread underground newspapers, and sheltered fugitives. Yet there was also collaboration. Some governments, local leaders, and ordinary citizens cooperated with the Nazis, whether out of fear, ideology, or opportunism. The Holocaust was not carried out by Hitler alone. It required bureaucrats, soldiers, guards, and informants. It thrived on the silence of bystanders. Caution for today. Evil advances not only through the cruelty of the few, but through the passivity of the many. By late 1942, Hitler's empire began to crumble. At Stalingrad, German forces were encircled and annihilated in one of history's bloodiest battles. In North Africa, the Allies drove the Nazis out. In 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, opening a second front in Europe. The Soviet Union, bearing the heaviest burden of the war, pushed westward with immense sacrifice. Slowly, relentlessly, the German army was forced back. By early 1945, Germany was in ruins. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated cities. Food shortages and despair gripped the population. Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, retreated into his underground bunker in Berlin. Surrounded, he raged against generals, fantasized about non-existent armies, and blamed everyone but himself. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler took his own life. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich was over. After the war, the world confronted the crimes of the Nazi regime. At the Nuremberg trials, leading officials were prosecuted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. For the first time in history, leaders were held personally accountable for atrocities committed under their rule. The message was clear. No one, not even heads of state, was above justice. The legacy of Adolf Hitler is one of destruction, a world war that killed over 70 million people, the Holocaust that annihilated entire communities, and a dictatorship that turned a modern, educated nation into a machine of death and conquest. His rise reminds us that dictators do not emerge in a vacuum. They grow in moments of crisis, feeding on fear, anger, and despair. They promise simple solutions, scapegoats to blame, and national rebirth through obedience. Though Hitler is gone, the dangers he embodied remain. Around the world, we see echoes of his tactics. The exploitation of economic hardship to fuel resentment. The vilification of minorities as enemies of the nation. The erosion of democratic institutions under the guise of security. The glorification of strongmen who promise order in exchange for obedience. Caution for today. Dictatorship does not always begin with tanks in the streets. It begins with words, with propaganda, with fear, with the quiet surrender of freedoms. The most important lesson is this: democracy survives only if its citizens defend it. It requires vigilance, questioning leaders, protecting institutions, and resisting the temptation to trade liberty for security. It requires courage, standing up for truth, for justice, and for the dignity of all people. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does echo. If we listen carefully, Hitler's story is not just about the past. It is a warning for the present. Adolf Hitler rose from obscurity to unleash unparalleled destruction. His life is a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition, blind obedience, and the corruption of power. But it is also a testament to the resilience of humanity, to those who resisted, to those who rebuilt, and to the enduring belief that freedom and justice must prevail. If there is one lesson to take from this history, it is this: never again